In December 1944, one radio message reached a trapped American company in Belgium. The order sounded calm, but it could have killed nearly 200 men. It told them to hold a frozen crossroads until first light. Headquarters saw a defensible road. The men saw a closing trap. Between those realities sat one signalman, listening through the winter static. This account follows Daniel Hale, a composite radio operator drawn from wartime records. Before the Army, Daniel repaired radios inside a small Ohio hardware store. He trusted wires and batteries because their failures usually left evidence. War taught him that messages could fail while sounding perfectly clear. That lesson became dangerous on the coldest night he remembered. The village was not famous, and its name barely survived the paperwork. It had a church, a schoolhouse, stone barns, and one usable road. That road mattered because trucks could still cross it after shelling. For that reason alone, tired soldiers were ordered to hold the crossroads. By midnight, the company no longer matched the morning report. The paperwork still suggested nearly 200 men around the position. The ground told another story after hours of artillery and confusion. Some men held houses near the church and the main road. Others watched the mill, the orchard, and the dark tree line. The wounded had been carried below the schoolhouse near Daniel's radio. His job was designed to stay simple when panic began spreading. He received words, copied them accurately, and moved them along. He was not trained to decide whether an order was wise. He was trained to keep command connected with men under fire. That discipline protected armies, but it also burdened ordinary soldiers. The first serious warning came after midnight, when the telephone line died. A wireman found the cable cut by shell fire outside the village. He repaired one break, then discovered another farther down the road. When he returned, his face carried news worse than damaged cable. German movement had been seen near the orchard behind the position. That meant the battle had already moved beyond the paper map. Daniel sent an updated report through the radio as clearly as possible. He included the damaged bridge, enemy movement, and the wounded count. He repeated the report after the first transmission brought no confirmation. Then he repeated it again when static swallowed the answer completely. For the next hour, the radio offered only fragments of control. One message suggested reinforcements were still moving toward the village. Another reported delays somewhere along the frozen road network. A third call sign appeared from a direction that made no sense. The line on the map no longer matched the ground outside. Inside the cellar, each failed report made the danger clearer. If the company stayed until dawn, German forces might surround it. If it withdrew without permission, another unit could be exposed. If it moved too slowly, the wounded would be left behind. Every possible decision now carried its own form of guilt. The lieutenant commanding the village studied the map beside Daniel's table. The captain had been wounded earlier, leaving him responsible for everyone. He was young enough to expect orders to explain reality. That night, reality was moving faster than orders could travel. At 3:17 in the morning, the signal suddenly cleared through static. Daniel heard the correct call sign and copied the authentication carefully. The message ordered the company to hold the crossroads until first light. It also promised reinforcements when dawn finally reached the village. Daniel wrote the words exactly because small mistakes could kill men. Then he looked at the map and understood the problem. The order assumed the western road was still open behind them. It assumed the damaged bridge could still support movement in darkness. It assumed enemy patrols had not passed behind the village. Each assumption had already collapsed somewhere beyond the cellar walls. The order was not foolish when it left headquarters. It became dangerous because the battlefield changed before it arrived. Bad orders are easiest to recognize when they sound panicked. This one sounded calm, measured, and backed by full authority. The lieutenant could not ignore it simply because it frightened him. An army cannot survive if every officer obeys only convenient orders. He had to decide whether the message still described the battle. Daniel could not make that decision from the radio table. Yet Daniel had become the only man holding both truths together. He knew what headquarters ordered and what the ground reported. Then German fire began striking the western edge of the village. That sound settled the map argument more brutally than words could. The road headquarters expected them to hold was already compromised. If the company waited until dawn, withdrawal might become impossible. The lieutenant chose to move before first light. It was not a speech, and it was not a movie moment. It was a quiet decision made under dust and artillery. The men would leave in groups through the creek bed. The walking wounded would move before the strongest riflemen. The rear guard would stay long enough to hide the withdrawal. Daniel's radio now carried the opposite burden from before. It had delivered the order that nearly trapped the company. Now it had to carry instructions that might save them. He could not explain the whole decision through a failing signal. Every phrase had to be short enough to survive static. He sent the plan to the scattered positions around the village. He repeated each instruction until some form of confirmation returned. When confirmation failed, he changed frequency and tried again. The church position answered after several seconds of static. The mortar crew answered later, weakly but clearly enough. The men near the mill did not answer at all. That silence became the hardest sound inside the cellar. Daniel kept calling because stopping felt like abandoning them. The lieutenant finally made him continue with positions still answering. That decision saved time, but it never became easy. Around 4:30, the first wounded men left the schoolhouse. They moved through the back garden and into the frozen ditch. Rifle slings were wrapped so metal would not strike stone. Men who could barely stand leaned on men barely stronger. German fire still tore into the center of the village. The enemy believed the Americans were holding their original line. That mistaken belief bought the company a few narrow minutes. In a withdrawal, minutes can separate escape from capture. Daniel stayed with the radio until the cellar was nearly empty. He reported that the company was abandoning the crossroads before dawn. He reported that the previous order could no longer be executed. He reported that enemy movement had cut the expected route. The answer from headquarters came back weak, broken, and incomplete. It did not first ask about the wounded or the road. It asked who had authorized the withdrawal from the village. Responsibility had finally traveled back through the same radio. The lieutenant accepted responsibility before the signal failed again. There was no approval, punishment, or final instruction afterward. Only static remained where authority had been seconds before. Before leaving, Daniel destroyed the code sheets in the cellar stove. He damaged the radio parts that could not be carried safely. Then he folded the original order and placed it inside his jacket. He did not keep it because it proved anyone innocent. He kept it because it proved the choice had been real. The withdrawal through the creek bed was neither clean nor complete. One group drifted too far south and was captured before noon. Several wounded men never reached the creek line behind the village. The mill position remained silent until after the crossroads was lost. Still, most of the company escaped before daylight closed the trap. They crossed the creek in scattered groups and reformed behind another line. The reinforcements promised by radio did not arrive at first light. By the time artillery hit the village again, most survivors were gone. The number 200 was never exact after that morning. War damages paperwork almost as easily as it damages buildings. Some names moved from present to wounded as lists were corrected. Other names moved from missing to captured days later. A few names remained missing long after the village changed hands. But the company was not destroyed inside the village. That was the difference made by one late radio message. It nearly held the men in place until dawn. It also forced the men on the ground to recognize reality. Daniel never became famous for what happened in that cellar. Radio operators rarely became famous unless their messages failed publicly. Their work was usually remembered by the men who depended on it. Yet his position carried a burden few people ever saw. He was close enough to hear the order clearly. He was also close enough to know why it was wrong. Years later, Daniel remembered the message because it sounded calm. If it had sounded frantic, the danger might have been obvious. Instead, it sounded like a sentence from a world still controlled. That world existed at headquarters, beneath lamps and paper maps. It did not exist in the cellar, orchard, or Western Road. The radio had not lied to him that night. It had carried an old truth too clearly and too late. That is why this story reaches beyond one unnamed village. World War II was fought with tanks, artillery, aircraft, and rifles. It was also fought through wires, batteries, call signs, and exhausted voices. Every battlefield depended on messages moving faster than the battle changed. When the battle moved faster, ordinary men faced impossible seconds. They were not generals, and they were not meant to decide strategy. They were the narrow bridge between command and survival. On that winter morning, one message changed nearly 200 lives. It did not save them by magic or courage alone. It changed them because it exposed the gap between order and reality. Once that gap was seen, It could no longer be ignored. The last order in the cellar told them to hold until dawn. The living men outside told a different story. Daniel heard both, and history often turns on that kind of hearing. Not through a grand speech and not through a perfect plan. Only through a man in darkness, listening when wrong words arrive too late.